Benjamin Harper had never considered himself a man who belonged to neighborhoods or committees or clubs, and when he took a year-long sabbatical from his university teaching job, he deliberately looked for a place that would keep him far from the chatter of faculty meetings, the endless debates over department budgets, and the social obligations that seemed to drain him more than inspire him. When a colleague mentioned that a friend had a mountain cabin available for rent, Benjamin did not hesitate, because the thought of a quiet retreat where the days were filled with silence broken only by wind moving through the pines or the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of snow sounded like the only real cure for the exhaustion he carried. The cabin itself, an old timber structure built some 40 years ago but maintained with surprising care, stood at the end of a narrow gravel path that veered away from the main road and curled along a ridge before stopping at a clearing that looked out across a deep valley. It was not grand or luxurious, but its weathered wood, the stone fireplace in the living room, and the uneven but sturdy porch had the air of something that had survived storms and winters and neglect. Proof that utility and endurance could sometimes be more beautiful than polish and style. For Benjamin, who had spent most of his life surrounded by abstract arguments and academic theories, there was a grounding effect in touching the rough wood of the railing or smelling the lingering smoke in the chimney, as if the house itself reminded him that ideas, no matter how elegant, were meaningless unless they were lived in something solid, something real. The first weeks were almost idyllic, and though he had promised himself that the time would be dedicated to writing, he found that he enjoyed the slow, almost meditative work of small repairs, tightening the loose hinges on the back door, oiling the stubborn window frames, stacking firewood in neat piles until the rows looked almost like an installation of order against the wilderness. Neighbors were scarce, the closest house a 10-minute drive downhill, yet occasionally Benjamin would notice a figure walking along the gravel road, often carrying a clipboard or stopping to take photographs of the tree line. He assumed they were surveyors or perhaps real estate people scouting the area, and because he was determined not to be drawn into local affairs, he paid little attention. What unsettled him, however, was the arrival of a large white box left on his porch one morning, its cardboard edges damp with dew, no note attached except for a neat printed brochure lying on top. Inside were a set of trinkets that seemed almost satirical in their forced cheerfulness. A mug with the words, "Our Community, Our Rules," printed in blue letters, a bundle of pens with identical logos, a packet of coupons for local services ranging from landscaping to pest control, and at the very bottom a folded booklet titled Homeowners Association, Guidelines for a Safe Future. Benjamin had never joined any association and, more importantly, had signed a lease with his friend that made no mention of obligations to any community organization, but curiosity made him leaf through the booklet, and it was there that his attention fixed on one passage, highlighted with dotted red lines, which stated that under extraordinary circumstances the HOA reserved the right to conduct unscheduled inspections of properties deemed potentially unsafe to the collective well-being. The phrasing was vague, at once legalistic and oddly threatening, as though behind the language of safety and well-being lurked the suggestion of intrusion and control, and Benjamin felt the old skepticism that had marked his academic work rise in him again, the tension between the rhetoric of collective good and the reality of individual autonomy. He set the booklet aside, trying to convince himself that it was irrelevant to him, that his cabin was a rental and not subject to such rules, but something about the anonymous delivery, the quiet certainty with which the package had been left at his door gnawed at him. When he looked out from the porch toward the gravel road that evening, he thought he saw a vehicle idling at the curve, headlights off, before it rolled away without sound. Still, he told himself that isolation breeds paranoia, and that perhaps this was nothing more than a poorly organized welcoming gesture. Yet the cabin, once a sanctuary, now seemed to carry a faint echo of surveillance. The creak of the rafters at night made him imagine steps in the attic, and the whir of the wind through the pines could, in certain moods, sound too much like the distant hum of machinery. He tried to refocus on his manuscript, but the words on the page blurred into thoughts of rules, committees, and the strange persistence of institutions that sought to extend themselves into every corner of private life, even here on the mountain ridge where he had come to be free of them. Benjamin's days in the cabin had begun to follow a slow rhythm, the kind of unstructured passage of time he had been craving for years, yet a rhythm that soon shifted into something more uneasy, because little by little the sense of being observed crept into his awareness. First through the faint mechanical buzz that reached him on a still afternoon when he looked up and saw a drone, black and insect-like, hovering above the tree line before sliding sideways into the sky, and then through the peculiar stillness of the gravel road, which on some mornings carried fresh tire marks even though he had heard no vehicle approaching or leaving during the night. He told himself that mountain life had its mysteries, and that surveyors and realtors came and went, but that rationalization cracked the moment he found the letter. It had been folded once, slipped under the front door with such precision that the edges aligned with the threshold, and when he opened it, the language was bureaucratic and clinical, printed in the same font as the brochure from the welcome box. Our inspection algorithm has identified potential structural concerns regarding your residence. Pursuant to Section 4, Subpart B of the Community Safety Mandate, an on-site assessment is scheduled within the next week. Please make preparations for temporary relocation in the event that unsafe conditions are confirmed. He read it twice, then 3 times, the words blurring into a mixture of disbelief and irritation, because there was no way that an algorithm had the authority to determine the fate of his rented cabin, and even less plausible that a group of homeowners, most of whom he had never met, could compel him to vacate. His first impulse was to call his friend, the cabin's owner, but the man was traveling abroad, unreachable for weeks, and Benjamin could imagine the frustration of trying to explain this situation across time zones to someone who had likely never bothered with the HOA in the first place. Instead, he searched for any legal disclaimer in the letter, something that might reveal it as a bluff, yet the signature line only bore the name Cynthia Dorset, President, followed by a reference number that suggested an official record somewhere. Existed. The unease deepened when he tried to trace the source of the letter. The return address was a post office box in town, nothing more, and when he drove down to the gas station to use the public Wi-Fi for a search, he found that the association had a slick website filled with photographs of smiling families, neat lawns, and the gleaming clubhouse that stood only a mile downhill from his cabin. On the site, there was a section describing new initiatives in predictive safety monitoring, complete with stylized diagrams of houses with colored overlays indicating zones of risk, all of which looked less like engineering assessments and more like abstract art designed to justify intervention. Buried at the bottom of the page was the explanation. Images collected by aerial survey, both manned and unmanned, were run through a proprietary system that generated safety scores. Properties falling below a certain threshold were automatically flagged for inspection. His cabin, apparently, had failed the test. The discovery filled him with both incredulity and anger. He was an educated man, capable of reading structural reports and judging with his own eyes the solidity of beams and joists, and nothing about the cabin indicated danger. The floors were level, the roof intact, the foundation visible and sound. Yet here was an organization of strangers telling him that mathematics performed by a faceless program outweighed his lived reality. He could not shake the feeling that the entire matter was not about safety, but about power, an attempt to extend the HOA's reach into places it had no business touching. That suspicion grew when, 2 days later, he heard footsteps outside at dawn and opened the door to find a pair of individuals in dark windbreakers with identical insignia stitched above the pocket, carrying tablet devices. They informed him, with a professional but curiously rehearsed tone, that they were conducting preliminary assessments ahead of the official inspection, that they required access to measure external stress factors, and that resistance to their entry would be noted in the record. Benjamin, standing in the doorway with the cold mountain air curling around his ankles, refused. He told them that the cabin was a rental, that he had not consented to any inspection, and that if they attempted to enter, he would consider it trespassing. The two exchanged a look, neither angry nor surprised, merely patient, as if this response had been predicted. One of them tapped something on the tablet, then slid a printed slip of paper into his hand. Refusal acknowledged. Subsequent assessment scheduled. They turned and walked down the gravel road without another word, leaving him staring at the paper that bore his name, the date, and a notation of non-compliant. That night, as the wood in the fireplace cracked and shadows stretched across the ceiling, Benjamin could not quiet his thoughts. He was a man who had lectured for years about the nature of authority, about how institutions perpetuated themselves not through force alone, but through the creation of narratives that made individuals doubt their own perceptions. And here he was, in the isolation he had sought, feeling the grip of that same machinery. He questioned whether to fight or to flee, to alert local authorities or simply ignore the entire charade. But the truth was that his sense of autonomy was already under siege, and ignoring it felt like surrender. He poured himself another glass of water, sat at the desk where his unfinished manuscript waited, and stared at the blinking cursor. The chapter he had been working on was about the limits of personal freedom, and as he tried to resume the sentence he had left unfinished, he realized that he was no longer writing in theory. The experiment had already begun, and he was the subject. Benjamin had believed that the letter and the visit from the two uniformed inspectors were already excessive intrusions into his solitude. Yet the real escalation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the association had decided that pressure would not come with a single blow, but through a sequence of small, disorienting steps designed to wear down his sense of certainty. It started with the sound of a vehicle in the middle of the night, tires crunching on gravel and then fading before he could reach the porch to see who had passed, and in the morning there were fresh orange markings sprayed near the base of the porch posts, circles with numbers and arrows as though surveyors had been mapping weaknesses. But no one had asked his permission, and no one had left any explanation. He took photographs, not because he trusted photographs to be effective evidence against an organization that already seemed to make its own rules, but because the act of documenting gave him a momentary illusion of control. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived, delivered not by mail but slid under the door again, the seal of the HOA embossed on the corner, and inside was a multi-page report filled with technical jargon, graphs, and color-coded charts, all of which presented the cabin as a structure on the verge of collapse. According to the report, the soil beneath the foundation was classified as unstable. The beams of the roof were assessed as having reached a critical fatigue threshold, and the likelihood of failure was rated at 78% within the next 6 months. The absurdity was obvious to him. The cabin had withstood decades of storms, snow, and neglect without any such issues, but the language of the document was so precise, the numbers so carefully arranged, that he felt the intended effect. Doubt began to creep into the corners of his mind. What if, despite his instincts, there was something hidden, something beyond his expertise? It was precisely this manipulation of uncertainty that he recognized as the true weapon, more dangerous than threats, because it transformed him into his own adversary. The next confrontation occurred when he decided to bring the report into town, hoping to find someone in the county office who could explain whether the HOA had any legal authority over a rented property in this location. The clerk he spoke with at first seemed helpful, searching records and shaking her head, insisting that the county had not commissioned any such inspection, that the data appeared to come entirely from the association's private initiative. Yet, just as Benjamin began to feel reassured, another man entered the office, introduced himself as a compliance liaison, and presented credentials that looked official enough to silence further questions. He spoke to the clerk in low tones, then turned to Benjamin and informed him that while the county itself had not initiated the inspection, they did recognize the association's monitoring program as a valid supplement, and therefore, any recommendation issued by the HOA would be treated with due seriousness. The words were delivered with such calm certainty that Benjamin felt the air go out of him, and when he pressed for clarification, the man merely said that documentation of safety hazards carried weight in any property dispute, especially if rental agreements were involved. It was clear that the network of authority was more entangled than he had imagined, each entity reinforcing the other so that responsibility was diffused, impossible to pin down. Back at the cabin, his attempts to carry on with routine tasks were repeatedly interrupted by subtle reminders of the association's presence. Small stakes appeared overnight along the edge of the clearing, each painted white and capped with reflective tape, as though delineating boundaries of some future project. A bright yellow notice was stapled to a tree near the driveway, declaring that access may be restricted pending further determination of safety status. Even deliveries became problematic. The small grocery store where he had arranged for occasional drop-offs suddenly refused to bring items up the ridge, citing liability concerns, and Benjamin suspected that the HOA had quietly warned them. Each inconvenience was minor on its own, but together they formed a tightening net, one that made the cabin feel less like a refuge and more like a cage. His frustration reached a breaking point when he found two men again outside the property line, not in uniform this time, but in plain clothes, standing beside a parked SUV and writing notes while pointing at the cabin. When he confronted them, they identified themselves as contractors hired to provide estimates for potential remediation work should the structure be condemned. Benjamin demanded to know on whose authority they were preparing such estimates, and they replied blandly that they were acting under directive from the community board. The audacity of discussing demolition and repair costs before any official ruling had even been made revealed the deeper intention. The HOA was not concerned about safety, but about acquisition, about clearing space for their own expansion, perhaps for the Clubhouse project he had seen advertised on their website. He realized then that resistance would not be a matter of argument, but of endurance, of whether he could withstand the grinding persistence of an organization that wore down opposition by simply never stopping. That evening, when the sun dropped behind the mountains and the forest sank into shadow, he sat at the wooden desk with the report spread before him, the false data highlighted in garish red and green, and he felt the contours of a battle he had not chosen forming around him. He thought of all the years spent lecturing students about the philosophy of institutions, about how authority often survived by transforming itself into procedure, by presenting itself as inevitable rather than forceful, and he could see that lesson enacted here in the quiet, relentless bureaucracy of his neighbors. It was no longer merely about a cabin's safety. It was about whether one man could assert the reality of his own experience against the manufactured consensus of an association determined to redefine truth. The day that altered everything began with a silence so heavy that Benjamin noticed it the moment he stepped outside. A silence not of peace but of suspension, as if the forest itself were waiting for something to occur. And he felt that waiting in his chest as he followed the crunch of his boots across the frosted ground toward the porch rail where he often lingered with a cup of coffee. The air was sharp, the kind of brittle mountain cold that usually carried sound for miles, yet not a bird called and not a branch cracked, and then the stillness was broken by the sudden arrival of vehicles, 3 in a row, pulling into the clearing with the officious choreography of people who believed their presence required no permission. Out stepped Cynthia Dorset, the president whose name had been signed on every letter, accompanied by several members of the board and 2 men carrying clipboards, followed by a small group of neighbors who had clearly been invited to witness what was described as a routine inspection. Benjamin was informed with rehearsed politeness that he was expected to allow entry into the cabin, and although his instinct screamed to refuse, he recognized that outright denial would only serve as fuel for their narrative of his non-compliance. So, he allowed them inside, watching with cold anger as they moved from room to room with handheld scanners and tablets, murmuring to one another in jargon-laden phrases that sounded scientific but revealed nothing. The intrusion stretched for nearly an hour, and Benjamin, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, caught the curious glances of the neighbors who had gathered behind Cynthia, ordinary residents who seemed both eager and uneasy, drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity to see whether the recluse in the mountain cabin would finally be unmasked as a risk to their fragile order. When at last Cynthia declared that preliminary results indicated severe risk factors and that the board would convene to issue a decision, she did so with a faint smile that suggested triumph, as though the outcome were already written, and the group began to file back toward their vehicles. Benjamin followed, his anger pressing against his ribs, but before he could confront her, the procession was interrupted by a sudden cracking sound from below the slope, sharp and resonant, followed by another, louder, a rhythm like bones snapping. Heads turned toward the gleaming clubhouse downhill, the very structure that had been celebrated on the association's website as the centerpiece of their vision, and even from the ridge they could see the roofline tremble, beams buckling with a groan, that carried across the valley. In a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, the front facade sagged, windows shattered outward, and with a roar of cascading timber and plaster the entire wing of the building collapsed in on itself, leaving a billow of dust that rose like a ghost into the frozen air. The silence that followed was not the calm of nature, but the stunned paralysis of human disbelief, and Benjamin could feel the shift in the crowd, the abrupt reversal of perspective as their eyes widened not at his cabin but at their proud monument, to control now lying in ruin. Cynthia tried to speak, tried to issue orders, but her voice faltered as the ground itself seemed to betray her authority, and murmurs spread among the neighbors. Questions whispered with the urgency of people realizing that the system they had trusted might be hollow. Benjamin, who had long suspected that the HOA's obsession with his cabin was less about safety and more about expansion, about freeing space for their grand projects, now watched with grim recognition as the truth revealed itself in the collapse of their own construction. It was not his refuge that was unsafe, it was theirs. He might have felt vindicated, but the spectacle did not bring relief. For even in their shock, Benjamin saw the seeds of the next maneuver forming, the way Cynthia's eyes narrowed as if recalculating the narrative, and he knew that she would not admit failure but would instead seek to redirect suspicion, to frame the disaster as evidence of sabotage or external interference. That fear became real within hours when a new letter arrived, this time hand-delivered by a courier, accusing Benjamin of obstructing inspection procedures and implying that vibrations from his property, absurdly from ordinary domestic activity, might have contributed to the destabilization of the clubhouse structure. The accusation was both ludicrous and insidious, because its absurdity was precisely what made it effective, sowing confusion in a community already desperate for explanation. Benjamin's response was not to issue denials, but to seek understanding, and so he began examining the fragments of evidence available to him, returning to the report that had branded his cabin unsafe and comparing its language to the promotional materials he had printed from the HOA website. What he found unsettled him further. Phrases lifted word for word between safety assessments and marketing copy, technical descriptions that seemed less like engineering judgments and more like recycled slogans. The collapse of the clubhouse, far from an act of God, appeared to Benjamin as the inevitable result of a project rushed for prestige, corners cut, oversight ignored, and then disguised under layers of jargon. He thought again of the inspectors who had visited him, the way they carried devices whose screens were never shown to him, the way their verdicts were always delivered as numbers without context. The realization pressed on him that he was not merely resisting neighbors, but a machinery of obfuscation. A system designed not to reveal truth, but to obscure it, and that the collapse was not a failure to them, but an obstacle to be rewritten in the record. That night, unable to sleep, he walked down toward the ruin of the clubhouse, ignoring the yellow caution tape strung hastily around the wreckage. And in the moonlight he saw not only the broken beams and shattered glass, but also the hasty patches of cement, the mismatched bolts, the telltale signs of negligence. He bent to touch a fallen joist and felt the grain crumble under his fingers. Unsealed, untreated wood that had no business bearing such weight, and anger surged through him, not only at the association but at the dishonesty that had been inflicted on the very people who now whispered accusations against him. When he turned back up the ridge, the lights of the cabin glimmered faintly, a reminder that the battle had shifted. He was no longer defending himself from abstract allegations, but standing against an organization willing to twist reality itself, to shield its own failings. By the time dawn rose and the valley filled with thin light, Benjamin knew the midpoint had been reached. The conflict was no longer about whether his cabin was safe, but about whether he could endure the campaign of distortion that would surely follow the collapse. The HOA had lost its monument, but in losing it, they had gained desperation, and desperate powers rarely retreat. They reinvent the story, they select a scapegoat, and Benjamin feared that he, the solitary renter with no allies and no voice in the board, had already been chosen. The collapse of the clubhouse might have seemed to an outside observer like a decisive turning point that would force the homeowners association to confront its own negligence. Yet Benjamin quickly learned that organizations so deeply invested in their self-image rarely accept responsibility. Instead, they mutate, adapting blame to fit a narrative that preserves their authority. And within days of the disaster, the community had been saturated with new explanations that shifted attention back to him. Letters circulated, unsigned but clearly produced by the same office printers as the inspection reports, claiming that unusual vibrations and unauthorized structural modifications at the cabin had destabilized soil across the ridge, and though the claim was ridiculous on its face, neighbors repeated it with the kind of nervous conviction that comes not from belief, but from the desperate need to believe something. When Benjamin walked into town to buy supplies, conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes tracked him as if he carried contagion, and one man muttered just loudly enough for him to hear that outsiders always bring trouble. The harassment did not remain abstract. Returning from one of these errands, Benjamin discovered that his driveway had been blocked with a row of orange cones and a laminated sign declaring the area restricted pending further safety review. Though no official seal or authority was listed, only the same HOA logo that now seemed to brand every surface of his life. He dragged the cones aside in fury, but the next morning they were back, this time accompanied by fresh spray-painted lines on the gravel that resembled construction boundaries. It was clear to him that the association had moved from persuasion to intimidation, marking his property as though the outcome of eviction were already assured. The tactics grew subtler as well. His mail began arriving already opened, and once when he lifted the lid of the wooden box at the end of the road, he found nothing inside but a folded sheet of paper bearing the word "Unsafe" in bold red ink. That night the intimidation became personal. He woke to the sound of movement outside, a shuffling over the porch planks, and when he stepped into the cold with a flashlight, the beam fell upon a small metal device affixed to the base of one of the support posts. It resembled the vibration sensors he had once seen in laboratories, a box no larger than a deck of cards with thin wires running into the soil, and though he could not prove it, he knew instinctively that the HOA had installed it, a piece of pseudo-technology meant to generate the data they needed. He pried it loose with a screwdriver and set it on his desk, determined to keep it as evidence. But the next day he found another identical unit lodged near the chimney, as though the house itself were being outfitted for its own indictment. The sense of violation pressed on him until even the creaks of the wooden beams at night began to sound less like the settling of a structure and more like the breathing of an intruder. Still, Benjamin was not willing to retreat into silence, and he began to search for inconsistencies that might expose the HOA's scheme. He revisited the wreckage of the clubhouse in daylight, carefully walking the perimeter where debris had been cleared, and discovered a sheaf of papers half buried under plaster dust, water-damaged but still legible, invoices from a contractor that had supplied substandard materials, boards labeled as untreated pine passed off as load-bearing timber. The papers bore the initials of Cynthia Dorset herself, signifying approval, and though he knew presenting them would provoke retaliation, he felt a grim satisfaction in holding proof that negligence was written into the very paperwork of the association's leadership. His suspicion that this was not simply incompetence, but deliberate misdirection, deepened when, later that week, two strangers approached him on the road, not in uniform and not pretending to be inspectors, but men with the polite vagueness of contractors offering services. They explained that they had been told his cabin might soon be vacated and that they were offering estimates for demolition and reconstruction. The words were delivered casually, as though the decision had already been made, and when Benjamin asked who had engaged them, they smiled in unison and said only, "The board." Their presence confirmed his worst fear. The HOA was already planning the erasure of his cabin, moving forward with a timeline that disregarded whether any legal judgment had been rendered. By now, neighbors had turned their unease into open hostility. One evening, as Benjamin returned from gathering firewood, he saw on the porch a crude effigy, a bundle of sticks bound with rope, daubed with red paint across the chest, that bore a scrap of paper reading, "Leave before it falls on you." He burned it in the fireplace, not out of superstition but to rid himself of the sight. Yet the image lingered in his mind, a reminder that the association's campaign was not limited to bureaucracy, but was beginning to infect the psychology of the entire community. He knew that once fear took root, reason became irrelevant, and a man marked as dangerous in the eyes of his neighbors would find no protection even in the law. The escalation culminated when Cynthia herself returned, this time without the entourage of inspectors, standing at the foot of the porch in the half-light of evening with the expression of someone who had calculated the exact degree of pressure required to break her target. She told him calmly that the board intended to vote on condemnation within the week, that continued resistance would result not only in forced removal, but also in liability claims for damages related to the clubhouse collapse, and that his best course was to vacate voluntarily before matters became, in her words, unpleasant. Benjamin listened in silence, the device he had pried from the foundation still on his desk behind him, the incriminating invoices folded in a drawer, and he realized that the conflict had become a contest of endurance, one that would not be decided by truth or reason but by who could withstand the attrition of intimidation longer. As she turned to leave, headlights sweeping across the trees from her waiting car, Benjamin felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He was now past the point of negotiation, trapped in a battle where the association had already scripted him as guilty, and his only path forward was to resist, not with pleas for fairness, but with evidence sharp enough to cut through their manufactured reality. The escalation had reached its second stage, and the pressure would not stop until either the cabin or the HOA itself collapsed under the strain. The week that followed was not measured by days, but by a tightening of pressure, as if each sunrise brought another layer of weight pressing down on the cabin, and Benjamin knew that the board's vote loomed not as a bureaucratic formality, but as the moment when his resistance would either shatter or prove immovable. He spent those days in a strange dual rhythm, on the one hand going through the ordinary motions of life, splitting firewood, brewing coffee, forcing himself to sit at the desk where his unfinished manuscript lay open, and, on the other hand, gathering, his fragments of evidence with a precision that bordered on obsession, the invoices signed by Cynthia, the vibration device pried from the foundation, the spray-painted markings that still stained the gravel like scars, even the effigy left on his porch. He arranged them in sequence across the wooden table, rehearsing silently what he might say, though he knew that words alone rarely pierce the armor of an organization determined to preserve itself. When the day of the board's assembly arrived, Benjamin walked down to the clubhouse ruins where the meeting had been relocated to a temporary tent pitched beside the wreckage, the collapsed beams still visible beyond the flapping canvas walls like a specter of their negligence. Inside, rows of folding chairs had been set for residents, and at the front a long table held the board members, Cynthia at the center with her posture rigid, her hands clasped in front of her as though she were already presiding over a trial. The atmosphere was taut, not with curiosity but with anticipation of conflict, and Benjamin felt every gaze follow him as he entered, the man already labeled in whispers as the saboteur. He carried with him a battered leather folder that contained the evidence, and though his hands trembled slightly, his stride was steady, because he understood that the moment demanded presence more than eloquence. The proceedings began with Cynthia reading aloud the charges in a voice measured and confident, citing alleged non-compliance, interference with safety procedures, and suspected contribution to the destabilization of the clubhouse. The words echoed through the tent like formal incantations, and for a moment Benjamin felt the futility of arguing against them, because in the language of procedure, guilt was often presumed long before proof. But when she gestured for him to respond, he stepped forward and laid the folder on the table, opening it not with a flourish but with deliberate calm, spreading the documents one by one. The invoices that proved substandard materials had been approved, the device that had been hidden in his foundation, the photographs of spray-painted markings, the papers stamped with Unsafe delivered through his mailbox. He said little at first, allowing the evidence to speak, and the murmurs that rippled through the residents behind him told him that even those predisposed against him could not ignore the incongruity. Cynthia attempted to dismiss the invoices as irrelevant, claiming they reflected preliminary drafts rather than final orders, but her voice wavered when one of the residents, a man who had helped fund the clubhouse, demanded to know why his money had purchased untreated timber. Another board member shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Benjamin pressed forward, holding up the small sensor device and asking in a low voice whether any resident had ever authorized the planting of surveillance instruments on private property. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation, because silence in such a room was its own admission. Sensing the tide turn, Cynthia tried to reassert control, standing to declare that the association's duty was collective safety, and that isolated individuals could not be allowed to obstruct progress. Yet, even as she spoke, her voice carried more strain than conviction, and Benjamin seized the moment to remind the assembly of the sight they all had witnessed, the proud clubhouse collapsing under its own fraudulence. He did not accuse, he simply asked how a structure celebrated as the pinnacle of safety could fall within weeks of opening, while the cabin that had been labeled dangerous still stood solid. The rhetorical balance shifted, and Benjamin could feel it in the restless movement of chairs, in the whispers now directed not at him but at the president who had guided them into ruin. The climax did not arrive with a shout but with a fracture, the sudden outburst of another board member who slammed his hand on the table and declared that he would no longer carry responsibility for Cynthia's decisions. The confession opened the floodgates. Others spoke, residents murmured, and the fragile facade of unanimity splintered before Benjamin's eyes. Cynthia's face stiffened, her authority crumbling not through argument but through exposure, and though she tried to adjourn the meeting, her words drowned in the noise of voices that no longer aligned with hers. Benjamin stood in the center of the storm, not triumphant but resolute, aware that what had broken here was not simply a case against him, but the association's illusion of invulnerability. When he walked back up the ridge that evening, the air was sharp again, But the silence was no longer heavy. It was open, the kind of silence that follows a storm when the ground is littered with debris, yet the sky has cleared. The cabin loomed ahead, weathered and steadfast, and for the first time in weeks Benjamin felt that its survival was no longer a question of safety reports or algorithms, but of his own endurance, proven against the weight of an entire institution that had sought to erase him. In the weeks after the assembly, the valley returned to its ordinary rhythms, snow thickening along the ridge, the roads echoing with the occasional rumble of delivery trucks. But for Benjamin, the air carried a different weight, not the suffocating pressure of surveillance, but the fragile quiet that follows upheaval, when neighbors speak more carefully, when gossip slows, when even those who had once turned their backs now avoid his eyes out of an unspoken recognition that the story had shifted. The board was effectively suspended, Cynthia stepping down under the pretext of personal health, though everyone knew her resignation was the inevitable consequence of evidence laid bare, and in her absence the association fragmented, meetings postponed indefinitely, projects halted, the glossy optimism of their brochures replaced by silence and uncertainty. Yet Benjamin did not celebrate, because victory was never the word he would use. What had been preserved was not triumph, but simply his right to remain, to live without being erased, and even that felt less like a gift than like the survival of something that should never have been threatened. At the cabin, he resumed his slow routines, stacking wood, brewing coffee, writing into the long winter nights, and though the sound of the forest sometimes still stirred echoes of suspicion, he found that he could sit again without flinching at every creak of timber. The documents remained in his drawer, the invoices and the sensor device, not trophies but reminders of how fragile the line between safety and control could be when words like risk and protection were wielded as weapons. He thought often of the students he had once lectured, how abstract his warnings about institutions must have sounded, and how different the lesson felt now that he had lived it in the grain of wood and the silence of neighbors. The cabin stood solid through the storms that winter, beams holding, roof steady, proof against the falsity of reports and algorithms. And when Benjamin walked the ridge at dusk, he carried no illusion that the battle had ended forever, only the quiet conviction that endurance itself had been his form of resistance.